You study nutrigenomics, which is the study of how nutrition affects gene expression. And I suppose a place to start would be, where did your curiosity begin? Was it in nutrition or was it in genes?
My curiosity with nutrigenomics began in the late 90s. I was a student at the University of Illinois studying nutrition. That's where I got my bachelor's and master's. And I was very interested in trying to figure out what diet works for people and why doesn't one compound or diet work for some people and not work for others. So that's what really piqued my interest.
And so how did you get over into the realm of like studying genes? Was it kind of just like, all right, well, food needs to be digested and ultimately, it's going to change something in the body? I guess how did you get to the point of genes? Because for me, you think like going down the route of becoming a registered dietitian would be the most logical step, right? So I guess, did you always have this idea of like individuality and understanding each individual human as an approach to nutrition?
Yeah. Everyone is a new person. Every client or patient is an N of one, or so they say. And because of that, there's not as much personalization as I'd like, but that's increasing. So you would say back in the heyday, everybody got put on the ADA diet, which is not very healthy for a lot of people. Basically, it's a high carb diet with maybe too many grains, which some people don't process as well. And let's not forget to mention all the chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, et cetera, that is utilized in the processing of all these different grains. So the original food guide pyramid, I'm not sure if it's officially dead or it's having if there's a wake for it, but maybe the last 5-10 years, most people are agreeing that the original food guide pyramid is no longer with us. We're having some new theories. A lot of people are experimenting with carb reduction, Atkins, keto, sometimes intermittent fasting, full fasting, or classical fasting techniques, as well as just the time-honored low-fat, vegetarian, vegan direction as well. So there are a lot of genes and SNPs that will point me to telling a client, hey, you know what? You seem to have none of the keto diet genes, which is maybe why the keto diet's not working. I have a friend, Jody, and she was trying to lose weight last year for the life of her, and she tried keto, and after 6 months of religiously following keto, she gained 3 pounds. So it's like, okay, that doesn't make any sense at all. So we looked up all her genetics, and she doesn't have any of the keto diet genetics. In fact, she has the opposite. She's got a lot of genetic variants that suggest a low-fat diet, reduction in total fat, reduction in saturated fat, work better for her. There are some people that will have issues. Like I had a lot of issues growing up. I had a lot of gas, bloating after meals, frequent stomach aches. I would say quite a few of my teenage years. And I don't know what the heck was wrong with me. I try to eat healthy. I try to eat right. Sometimes I did, sometimes I had fast food, but it didn't seem to make too much of a difference until I started actually personalizing my diet, which I did in the 90s. And I got to a better spot, and I had frequent constipation, all sorts of gastrointestinal issues. Nobody really diagnosed it, like no doctor. There wasn't no IBS back in the early 90s, but nowadays, yeah, I had IBS, IBS-C with some constipation. I definitely had IBS symptoms.
And you noticed at a young age that you were having difficulties with certain foods, I guess. When did it become kind of commonplace, or is it even commonplace now for people to visualize nutrition on a gene individual, like individuals by their genes, or individuals like in regards to nutrition?
It became commonplace. Full genetics didn't really start until just a few years ago, because after the Human Genome Project was complete, it took a little bit for companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, all these other genetic companies, MyHeritage, for them to start putting genetic testing out there available for the consumer.
Hmm.
So the first genetic test cost $100 million. The second one, I don't know, probably, I don't know, 200,000. So eventually that price went so far, it got under 1,000. Nowadays, you can get a genetic test. They go on sale for anywhere from $59 to $79.
Hmm.
So the price has gone down so much, and it's great because people can actually get their tests done. So when you have, so genetics is part of it, right? And it became, I guess, it became popular genetic testing to see where you're from with places like 23andMe. I guess 2012, 2013, that started coming out. They got pretty big by, let's say, 2014. And nutrigenomics, so companies taking the raw data and looking at it, that started to become popular around 2016. And microbiome analysis, or people taking a stool sample data and analyzing bacteria, maybe around 2017. That
Hmm.
started becoming popular, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So there was like a little bit of a discrepancy between your body's genetics and your microbiome genetics.
Yeah, we're going to get into the microbiome as well as just like the technology involved in analyzing genes. But I guess in your own words, how would you describe what genes are, and how unique are they? Like we said that before, kind of we've already like said that it's a given that our genes are unique to one another, but are they really, really different? Or are we kind of same in a lot of different ways?
Our genes are very unique in some ways and not that unique in others. It depends on which genes. It also depends on your ethnicity. So, for example, if you have some genetic variants that increase risk of, let's say, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you may have variant number 1, 2, and 4 if you're European. But if you're Asian, you may have variant number 4 and 7. And if you have African ancestry, it could be 2, 3, and 7. It just depends on where you're from, which variants would cause an increase in diabetes. And that has to do with just adaptation and different human populations in different parts of the world. So, like, for example, if you're a European, you're in Northern Europe surviving the cold, right? You're trying to survive a winter. So there are certain genes that can help you adapt, like ability to process a high-fat diet. That's probably a good one.
Hmm.
Ability to put up with some energy expenditure issues, like not having enough food while you're still waiting for crops to grow in the spring and it just thawed out. Whereas, if you're a human being living in sub-Saharan Africa, there's not so much of a freezing issue. It's more of your immune system has to be better able to fight things like malaria and different parasites in a more hot or humid environment. And also to an extent, Southeast Asia, which has a lot of similar hot, humid environments. So it kind of depends on where you're from and what your ancestors had to endure that can affect what genetic variants you may have more or less of, because the variants that didn't work out, those people didn't make it.
Mm.
So essentially, everybody on this planet is like the ultimate elite athlete of thousands of their ancestors' problems, ailments, failed attempts, issues. So we kind of made it. We're like the all-star team, all 8 billion of us.
Well, interesting, ultimately who we are, like you said, the all-star team of genetic improvements, and that there was a natural biology that ultimately led to our own individual gene sequences. And even right now, I'm sure there's gene Darwinianism, so to speak, playing out, trying to figure out like what are the most optimal genes that we need to have in order for us to survive in the life that we live right now.
Right, right. So one example of that is the Alzheimer's gene, the ApoE gene. So people are afraid of the Alzheimer's gene. They say, "Oh no, I hope I don't have it." Some of my patients, they don't even want to know. They say, "Well, you know what? If I have it, don't tell me." So then I won't tell them. However, it's better if you know, because you could fight it. So like the average person, I think it's the odds of dying of Alzheimer's is something like, I don't know, 4 or 5%. But then if you have the Alzheimer's gene, it's double that. So it might be like close to 10% or 8%. If you have both copies, which is kind of rare, maybe only 1 out of 50 people have both copies. And I think I have 3 clients now that have both copies. So those people, it's not double the risk. It's like 15 times the risk.
Mm.
So it's a really significant increase. But if you have one copy, which most people with the Alzheimer's gene have one, it's a benefit in some ways, because if you can process cholesterol better, yeah, sure, some of it may deposit in your brain, increasing amyloid plaque deposition that's causing Alzheimer's, but you're able to clear fat from the bloodstream, so you're skinnier. So people have less obesity who have the Alzheimer's gene.
Mm.
Also, because of that, you have less rates of type 2 diabetes if you have the Alzheimer's gene. You also have a reduced risk of peripheral vascular disease. So there's about 4 or 5 different improvements in your genetics if you have the Alzheimer's gene.
Interesting.
The same thing with the opposite. So if you have the anti-Alzheimer's gene, that would be the ApoE2, not the 4, then you have all these other issues, inability to process fats as well, peripheral vascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, et cetera. So having a gene for one problem sometimes means there's a benefit somewhere else, or else we wouldn't have it.
Right. And you're looking at you're looking at a whole genetic code. And so basically, like, our DNA is this genetic code of us, right? It's like our blueprint of who we are. And these genes, just because we have them, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll like have Alzheimer's or we'll have these things, but we have a higher likelihood of them presenting themselves later in life. And then that's what you mean by them more or less 15% more chance that you're probably going to have Alzheimer's or whatever.
Right. But the good thing is, once you know what the genetic variants are, a lot of times you could do something about them. So there's some studies showing the 15 times the risk. If you have both copies, you could reduce that to just twice the risk. So that's like going from 15 down to 2 is pretty good. And that's what you can do with a healthy diet. So for example, reducing fried foods, increasing healthier fats, less omega-6, more omega-3s, more monounsaturated fat, exercise, taking frequent saunas as you get older to get extra circulation in the brain. There's also a component called autophagy, which is like the body's way of clearing out junk proteins inside of cells. So autophagy genes, if you have impaired autophagy genes and you increase the function of them, they're able to process these junk proteins so the cell doesn't die. And then what's your brain made up of? It's made up of neurons, which are brain cells. So this will help keep your brain cells junk free so they don't die. Because that's what Alzheimer's is too much inflammation, too much junk deposition, and then you have too many neurons dying. And you have a physical shrinking of the brain. In fact, that's how they can tell, oh, your Alzheimer's, you have some Alzheimer's. Oh, your Alzheimer's is moderate. They just look at the size of your brain and see how it's shrinking over time. So the way to keep your brain cells alive is one way you can do it is increasing autophagy. And you can do that with intermittent fasting, actual fasting, and taking certain supplements. For example, taking the sugar trehalose, which is like 3 sugar molecules put together, certain types of molecules. Trehalose is an enhancer of autophagy. And also taking small amounts called microdosing of lithium, like lithium orotate. A lot of people take lithium supplements, 5-10 milligrams, as well as melatonin. So all of these compounds, just because you can get a good night's sleep, doesn't mean you don't need to take melatonin, especially if you have the ApoE4 gene. Maybe you want to take a low dose melatonin, low dose lithium. Sure, certainly couldn't hurt, and it induces autophagy, as well as intermittent fasting. So maybe just eat 9 hours a day instead of eating all day,
Right.
and maybe like once a week, just don't eat breakfast and lunch. Just wait till dinner. Do a 24-hour fast essentially to increase autophagy. Maybe once every 2-3 months, just like don't eat for a whole day. Do a 35-hour fast, or don't eat for 2 days, maybe a couple times a year. What does this do? Increases autophagy, increases the cleaning up of junk proteins. When you fast, after a certain time, I don't know what that number is, it varies for people, 15 to 30 hours. So after that time, uh, your body starts to increase basically cellular cleanup. It really works.
I mean, well, one question I have is like, how do we know? How does the scientist go in and say like, okay, there's this Alzheimer gene and they're expressing it this way, and you know, how do we measure that a ketogenic diet or fasting is going to help decrease that risk? Like, are we? They're so small, and there's a lot of things that happen when we fast and change our diet, and so I guess how do we know that it's like correlation equals causation in a lot of these instances?
Sure. There have been some trials actually done, but of course you can't do double-blind trials. I mean, people know they're fasting. They're like, boy, I wish I had that hamburger right now.
Yeah, right.
Um, However, there's enough data out there that is pretty convincing that there's an effect. For example, numerous animal studies and various different types of animals show that when you restrict intake, the animal lives like 30–40% longer, like some insane number.
Mm.
So we know that works. Also, intermittent fasting, people have looked at, telomere lengths and other markers like heart rate, blood pressure, A1C, all different types of markers. And when you do a periodic fasting, and for some people intermittent fasting, there are improvements in these. So improvements in those are not really associations. They probably do cause increased longevity, especially when you get to like telomere length and gastrointestinal improvements, and also reduction of obesity. If you if you fast one day a week, right, and then maybe like one day a month you do like a whole weekend fast, you're not eating those days, so you're getting fewer calories. And the proponents of that would say that, and then the skeptics would say, yeah, but that's fine, that's all fine and dandy, but when you start eating again, you're gonna do a rebound and eat even more. And the truth is, they've shown studies on this. So people who do periodic fasting, they don't end up weighing more if they're eating healthy. They usually weigh the same or better. So it's not a matter of you're talking about a yo-yo diet. So getting on some type of diet and then afterwards just eating whatever, which isn't the case, because this is like eating healthy and having a personalized diet. So a lot of people, they take some nutrigenomics test and it'll tell them, well, maybe you need to beef up on, whether it's choline or whether it's B vitamins or extra fish oil or extra exercise or meditation. It can help improve and have long-lasting effects.
So when you're analyzing people's DNA and looking at various aspects of who they are as an individual, I guess, are you using that to determine what kind of nutrients their body may need? And then are you using intermittent fasting and maybe other modes of diet to intervene, or are you kind of just using fasting and then changing the diet as you go along? I guess, is it just more of just like analyzing the DNA or the genetics better for just what you should eat, or is it actually to figure out like what kind of diet is better for you?
Oh, sure. Usually at first, I don't really push intermittent fasting or classical fasting. Well, everybody intermittent fasts anyway, because when you go to bed, you're by default intermittent fasting.
Right.
So it's more like how much of it, what's the level, and then of course classical fasting, how long. Not a lot of people can. Not a lot of people think they can fast, but they actually can. The human body is able to do things that would not, people wouldn't believe that they can do the things that they would be able to do. Humans have a lot of secret weapons in their tool chest that they didn't know. So one of those weapons is the ability to kill cancer cells. So when you fast, you are essentially increasing autophagy, which not only can kill some cancer cells, but it can also repair precancerous cells.
What is that? Maybe just explain that before you go further.
That's a very strange concept, but certain cells that are precancerous, there's some research that shows they can actually be reprogrammed to become either less cancerous or not cancerous at all. It is a very strange paradigm shift to think that that may be possible, because usually, when you think of cancer, you're thinking, okay, well, kill it or remove it, right?
Right.
Chemo, radiation, surgery, removal. But yeah, there's been quite a lot of in vitro studies and some animal studies, not so much experimenting on live humans, but there's actually some research that certain proteins and pathways can be reformulated, reshaped, so that you can actually make a semi sort of cancerous cell less cancerous. So cancer doesn't really, it's not like you have cancer or you don't. There's like degrees of it.
Right.
So maybe one mutation activates a certain pathway, and then maybe the next mutation turns off some other thing that stops cancer. And eventually, once you get to 4, 5, 8, 9 mutations, just depending on the cancer, then there's like massive proliferation. But that takes time. So genetic damage, that's why people should be eating, more fruits and vegetables of various colors, polyphenols that are in like berries, berries that are blue, purple, red, orange, different types. Same thing with vegetables, cauliflower, broccoli, all different types and colors. Basically, the more white and yellow a fruit or vegetable is, not that, pears are bad, they're very good for you, and so are apples. But there's some compounds that are contained in blue, red, and purple fruits and vegetables that you just really need. You need for optimal health. So, yeah, I suggest people who hate vegetables, they get over it.
Well, can all chronic disease be due to abnormal gene expression? I mean, we've been saying how cancer forms by multiple replication of these cells, and with Alzheimer's, there's these genes that can ultimately determine whether you're going to get it or not. And are all chronic diseases based off of like abnormal gene expression?
That is a very good question. Chronic disease is usually a combination. So things that affect you and things that affect that increase low-level inflammation, which is a big factor for chronic disease. Genetics plays a part, of course. However, it's not the only part. And if you look back 100 years ago, we didn't have rampant cancer. And sure, people didn't live as long, but even then, people who lived into their 60s, 70s, 80s, they weren't all dying of cancer. In fact, even 40 years ago, you'd have these scientists, they'd fly around the world to meet some kid with cancer, because it's so unusual. Nowadays, you walk into any park and out of a whole bunch of kids, there's probably 4 or 5 of them with cancer. I mean, it is unbelievable just how much rates of cancer have increased in America. And not just cancer, but other issues too. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune, asthma, all sorts of issues. And the question is, how do we get there? I mean, we spend more money we're in the US, so we spend more money on healthcare than any country in the world. And yet we're one of the sickest first world countries in the world. So that doesn't even make sense. So now you have to look at why, and they don't know why. Well, we're not really sure why. Well, I have some ideas. Maybe look at what we're doing to our immune systems, what we're doing to chemicals, any kind of chemicals, additives that we're putting into our body, whether it be medicines, whether it be various pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, et cetera, herbicides that are added to foods. All these are factors. You also have to consider FDA approval. The FDA is corrupt. So all you FDA people out there, you're corrupt. Not maybe you personally, but your organization is not 100% on the up and up. And here's the proof. All these studies that prove that a drug or a compound is safe and gets FDA approval, all the phase 1 trials and the in vitro studies and animal studies, how many hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials, phase 4 trials, seal of approval, wholeheartedly approved by the FDA. And what happens 10 years later? Banned by the FDA. Did the laws of physics magically change in 10 years? Did the laws of biochemistry change? Or maybe some people pulled a fast one just to get some drug out there so they can make an extra couple billion. So because of that, it's hard to trust the FDA. People wonder, why don't people trust the government? Well, it'd be a lot easier to trust the government if the government didn't do such crazy things like putting out drugs and chemicals and compounds and then later banning them after 10, 15 years. Oh, this one causes cancer. Oops. Oh, my bad, guys. We apologize.
Mm.
So yeah, ingesting xenobiotics, which are foreign compounds, in the form of drugs and things added to foods, that's kind of a big deal, and that's going to have to change. And it's going to take a grassroots effort of people getting together and not putting up with lobbyists anymore, and not putting up with, okay, you know what? Sure, capitalism is great. I love capitalism. I think people should work hard and be rewarded for it. But there's a lot of nepotism, and somebody's like head of some big pharma company, and then all of a sudden they're on the board of the FDA, and then they quit, and then they get hired by some other big pharma company, and it's kind of like a revolving door of biased, essentially people with strong biases, and there's a lot of profit motive, and so that's an issue because people are suffering needlessly. Like these drugs, there are many, many instances of major companies being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. Recently, Pfizer was fined $1 billion. That's like the #1 fine in the history of the world by a company. That's a really big deal.
Yeah.
So I think ethics are going to improve in the future. I think people are a little bit more awake now, and they're realizing that, hey, you know what? We need to look into this more. And the more the common citizen plays a part in their local and state governments and nationwide, I think the world's going to improve because there's a few corrupt maybe individuals at the top, but the rest of us don't have those evil intentions. We want a better place. So I think we could really improve health for everybody.
And with a lot of these foods that maybe have all these perhaps pesticides and things on them that ultimately can lead to perhaps maybe cancer and things like that, I guess, how do you take an approach to start eating more healthy then if, people only have access to certain foods in certain areas that probably maybe have these pesticides and things on them? Like, I guess, how do you combat that idea? Is it more of just trying to buy locally? Is it, I guess, what would you say?
Oh, I would say the most important thing is buying locally is a big deal. If you have access to a backyard, have your own vegetable garden. That's also a pretty big deal to be able to grow your own vegetables, because if you're pouring glyphosate, hopefully it won't be like, getting rid of weeds right around your vegetable garden with glyphosate, which I know people who've done this. I'm like, what are you doing? That's the whole point of this vegetable garden. And you're spraying Roundup. I mean, come on, guys.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big deal. Yeah, you can do that. Other things you could do is using nutrigenomics. You could figure out if you have the genes that may have issues with detoxification. So different detox enzyme. A lot of these are liver enzymes. So if you have genomic issues like low activity of certain genes, you kind of want to know that. So then you could protect yourself. You could either take some supplements which increase activity of these, or you could just avoid it. Like, for example, not even pesticides, although it does contain them, but arsenic is a big deal. Arsenic is one of the top heavy metal toxicities in the world. So there are certain genetic variants that increase issues from arsenic. And you can increase the levels of those, and you could also just consume less arsenic. For example, a big source of arsenic, you wouldn't believe this, and it's in a food that you would not expect it to be in: vegan protein powders. So when people think of healthy, they think, oh, this person must be really healthy. eats a lot of vegetables. Maybe they're vegetarian or vegan. And people who are vegan, maybe they want to supplement, get a little extra protein since they're vegan. So they get a vegan shake, right? So I think like 2/3 of the top vegan protein shake brands have high levels of arsenic.
Mm.
And that's not because uh, the main reason is because plants have more arsenic than animal products. So like a whey protein shake would have a lot less. But it's interesting to know that. So if you're on a high protein diet and you're vegan and you consuming this and you look at your genetic variants and you have a lot of these arsenic variants or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, then you have a choice to make. You can take certain compounds to upregulate those detox enzymes, right? Or you could do some periodic fasting, or maybe don't always take those shakes, or maybe like do like a combination, right? Sometimes you may have this protein shake, sometimes you might have something else, sort of like hedging your bets with stocks. You could hedge your bets with different types of protein shakes. So there's certainly things you can do.
Yeah, and I guess from a perspective of just like a public, like a regulator for like food, understanding that there's so much bio individuality between humans with gene expression and stuff. I guess like how do you work at a mass scale when you know that everybody's so individually different? For instance, you know, there's some people who are allergic to peanut butter, but we don't stop making peanut butter or putting them in cookies or putting them in things that perhaps are available to everybody else. And so it's, I guess, from a mass perspective, which is like a public health narrative, how would you try to look at that? And is it just trying to look at the individual and trying to say like, hey, you got to go and get your genetics looked at to figure out what diet works best for you?
Yeah, very good question. I don't have the answer to that. It's hard to say for the average person. I would say 10 years ago, you didn't really have an option, but nowadays, nutrigenomic testing is so cheap. Basically, for under $100 test and maybe another $100 or $200 some high-tech analyses, you can have meaningful information that can help improve your life. And you can also upload your genetic raw data to various sort of do-it-yourself sites. So if you applied yourself and you got a little bit interested in it, that can really be impactful. So even nowadays, with somebody on a budget, they can have meaningful improvements in health based on nutrigenomics, microbiome. Like microbiome testing used to cost hundreds of dollars. Nowadays, on sale, you can get a cheap microbiome test for 70, $80. So basically for $200 or $300, you can have more meaningful data than 10 years ago, flying to Mayo Clinic. So that's a pretty big jump in medical, I guess, medical technology. Even though it's not so much allopathic, it is becoming more common. I've been working with Dr. Diadamo from the blood type diet guy, and also a little bit with a couple other companies, including Self Decode. And I can tell you right now, the future of personalized medicine, it's going to be out of control. I mean, 5-10 years from now, you won't even recognize it. They're combining EMR, emergency medical records, ability to track your blood test to see how your cholesterol improved, et cetera, all these different markers. People are doing organic acid tests, microbiome tests. Microbiome tests used to be bacteria. Now they're looking at zonulin, these molecules associated with whether you have a celiac or gluten digestion issues. They're looking at unbelievable H. pylori, amoebas, fungus, yeast levels, all sorts of markers that just weren't available even 5 years ago. So all that's available now.
What is the significance of the gut microbiome?
Gut microbiome is very important to human health because your immune system interacts with the microbiome. So when you eat certain foods, about 70% of your white blood cells are in your gut, and they essentially try to figure out who's friend and who's foe. That's why some of the biggest issues with the environment has to do with gastrointestinal issues and pulmonary, lung infections issues, because that's how we take in air while we breathe and how we take in fluids and food when we eat. So our immune system has to figure out, okay, there's this molecule. What the heck is this molecule? Is this thing like a product from a bacteria? If it is, okay, it's go time. It's World War III. Let's have inflammation, massive diarrhea. Let's get this thing out of here. Or, hey, wait a minute. This is just food. Our master Johnny, he was just having a sandwich. Let's not have World War III. So your immune system has to make these hard calls, and it's making calls based on evolution, adaptation, years of trial and error. That's why people from maybe certain countries have overall increased allergies or issues with certain foods and not others, just because their ancestors didn't eat them. So, for example, people who are Tibetan, they seem to have an improved ability to tolerate dairy products. And why is that? Well, that's where the first domestication of animals took place. And what happens when you domesticate animals? You milk them and you have fermented dairy. Of course, back then we didn't have fridge, right? So, it would be basically kefir type, yogurty type cheese and curds. Those basically kept a little bit better, right, than milk, because milk soured right away, unless it was like, winter. So people in that area did better with dairy. So what's the furthest place away from Tibet? Maybe Africa. So that's why, people in Africa maybe don't do as well with dairy as some others, just because their ancestors didn't have a lot of exposure to it. But you know what? If you're of African ancestry, you'll do better against various parasites, because your ancestors, the ones who didn't do as well, they're not around to tell about it, and then they didn't pass on their genes. So they'll have improved, bit of a stronger immune system.
And when you
And
say
the same thing with people in South Asia, same thing with people in Eastern Asia, same thing with people in wherever, any part of the world, whatever killed off everybody, the people who survived, they have obviously, like, for example, the Black Plague. The Black Plague is preferential for people with blood type O. So when it ravaged Europe, a lot of the people with type O died off. Same thing with cholera. It killed off people who are blood type O. Other diseases will take out people who are type B or type A. And that's how you have different percentages of various genes throughout the world.
And when you say don't do well with, are you essentially just saying a genetic mutation, or that gene variation is just not, your genes in that variation aren't able to handle X, Y, and Z, whether it's dairy or a disease or whatever? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So
are all genetic mutations bad then? Or, I mean, I guess, like, we have so much variance. I guess my next question would be, like, is it always bad to have mutations then, or is it just a normal process? Or maybe just explain that a little bit more.
Oh, sure. So a mutation is not necessarily bad. In fact, I would say maybe 95% of mutations or variants are bad in some ways, but good in other ways. So, for example, a mutation, let's say a mutation that 20% of people have, but 80% of people don't have, and is associated with obesity, it would be considered bad in today's Western world, where everyone's trying to lose a few pounds and food is plenty. However, in times of famine, or let's say you're born in, Eastern Africa, and you're born in a country that's starving, you kind of want the obesity gene so you could hold on to calories so you could survive. So then you could, pass that on to ancestors, and your progeny could survive. So it's not always bad. It's resilience, right? And it's not just genetics, it's epigenetics. So epigenetics is not just mutations or variants, but methylation and histone modification. And these two other things that can happen to your genes can pass on for 1, 2, 4. In chickens, they did it up to 13 generations. that can silence certain genes or turn some genes on that normally were off. And for example, with chickens, they did a study. They bred chickens for 13 generations. And after 13 generations, chickens were inside the whole time, didn't see any other birds. And you fly a dove above them, they didn't care. You fly other birds above them, they don't care. But then you fly a bird of prey above them, and the chicken totally freaks out. If you put a picture of a bird of prey, which, let's face it, looks pretty similar to any other bird, but somehow this chicken that's had no experience with anything for 13 generations knows exactly the difference between a dove and a condor, or an eagle and I don't know, a crow. It knows exactly the difference. That's amazing. And some of that stuff is ingrained into their genetic memory, so to speak. And so there's a lot of research going on with epigenetics. And the question is, how many generations can you pass something along? So for example, in the 1860s, there's some Swedish data that shows kids who were well fed. So, mom and grandma made sure they had as much food as they wanted. No famine whatsoever, right? So kids who are really, really well fed into early and middle childhood, their grandkids had like 2 to 3 times the risk of obesity. So how does that happen? This is their grandkids. So it's not genetics, it's something else. And that's what it's epigenetics. So there are certain things you could do to genes like methylation. So instead of a mutation, you have a methylation. You have a methyl group, a CH2 or CH3 attaching to the genes, to the actual DNA. And then when it gets copied, then that also gets copied.
That's, my mind immediately goes to like, we're going to be able to just take in and out any genes that we want and kind of dictate like what our children look like at that point. I mean, is it heading that direction?
Hopefully not, because I really don't want it to get that advanced.
Right.
I still like some nature. In my mind, I'm thinking of Star Trek, and people being in a free society, and being able to explore and have a nice life, but also have technology, but also nature, kind of like a nice blend. So hopefully it won't get too far along that direction.
And does our genes dictate what our like preference in food or cravings are? Is that kind of part of that, or is that something completely different?
Oh, it's a big part of it. So this one gene we have, that you can get a mutation. You could either have the GGC mutation or the cat variant. So if you have GGC, you're a super taster. So bitter things taste horribly bitter. You hate IPAs. I've met one person. I've done hundreds and hundreds of these. It's called prop taster strip tests to see if the person can detect this propylthiouracil (PTC) strip. So you put this on the tongue, and it's like either super bitter, kind of bitter, or it just tastes like paper. So I've met one guy who's a super taster, and he likes IPAs. All the other 200 super tasters I've ever tasted just absolutely hate IPAs. So that's important, because those people have increased risk of cancer, because they hate vegetables, because vegetables are bitter. And if you hate bitter vegetables and you don't eat them, you're not eating all those cruciferous vegetables. You're not eating the broccoli, the cauliflower, the Brussels sprouts, yada, yada, yada. All those are anti-cancer. So you have a little bit increased rates of cancer. You know what else is bitter? Nicotine. So those people also don't smoke as much, because it's hard to get addicted to a cigarette that when you put it in your mouth, it tastes ridiculously bitter. Super tasters also have benefits. They have reduced chances of alcoholism. Why? Because a lot of alcoholic drinks are really bitter, like beer and mixed drinks, et cetera, et cetera. A bitter martini, et cetera. People who are super tasters, they have more taste buds in general on their tongue and their entire oral cavity. So they have their fill. They tend to have more cravings and get hungrier, but then they tend to fill up quicker. And so they have reduced risk of obesity. So there's benefits and drawbacks to being super tasters and being non-tasters. So you can imagine, 4,000 years ago, one of your ancestors is like roaming the steppes of Russia and comes across some carcass, and it's like, I don't know, I could eat this thing. I'm really hungry. So the super taster would taste something funny. Maybe it's some bacteria, blah, throws it up, right? That person might starve to death. But if you have a strong stomach, maybe a non-taster would be advantageous because you could get those calories, right?
Yeah.
So advantages and drawbacks to everything. And there's also a genetic variance governing acidity and sweet also. So one thing is super tasters don't like bitter. So super tasters like saltier foods. And the reason is salt masks the bitter taste. So they can handle bitter stuff. So they
Maybe
end
I
up
should
with
get tested because I like IPAs and I like salty food. So I don't know. This isn't
Well, you might
sounding
have
too
one
good.
copy. Yeah, you
What's it?
might have one copy of it. Who knows?
Right. Yeah, who knows? That's interesting. I think I need to get out there and buy one of those tests to figure out what's going on here.
Oh yeah, I think 23andMe, it's like 79 on sale for the next, I don't know, for the holidays, and Ancestry, I think it's like 59 bucks on sale right now. So yeah, now's the time to get one of those. I would say if you want to know Alzheimer's risks, 23andMe is a little better because they have the ApoE gene. And then otherwise, probably Ancestry is a little better
Mm.
because they have more SNPs, and they also have MAOA, the gene that governs a lot of anxiety, depression, like mental health. And they also have more COVID SNPs associated with the COVID-19 severity. So I'd probably get the Ancestry, unless, like I said, not too many mental health, but more Alzheimer's than 23andMe.
That's interesting. And, we talk about cravings. And so, you also said that like early on when you're younger, there's certain things that, you may not express until you're like older. And is that why like our preferences and diet continue to change? Because I know when I was a kid, all I liked was pizza, French fries, and the bait, like that stuff. But now I'm only, not that I don't love that stuff. Don't get me wrong, I love pizza and French fries, but my palate is much larger. And so, is it just because as you're getting older, your genes are starting to express differently, or perhaps the genes that like you already had are now starting to express themselves?
Yeah, that's part of the reason. People who are super tasters or even slight tasters, they don't like bitter foods. They don't like vegetables as much when they're kids, but then the preferences change a little bit as they get older.
Mm.
So they do have a little bit reduced expression of those taste receptors. And so yeah, as you get older, you'll be able to enjoy that more. But then when you get really old, sometimes there's ageusia and inability to taste. So then there's other problems with the geriatric population. Like once you get into your 80s and 90s, then some things are harder to taste and smell, um, which is actually a risk because if you're eating something that's spoiled, you might not be able to detect it.
Mm.
So it's food safety becomes important once you get like really old. Once you become ancient, you have to be more careful with foods.
And we're talking about food, but I guess does medications also play a role in, gene mutation and expression?
Oh yeah. In fact, there are many companies that do pharmacogenomics. So they'll run a panel and tell you, well, you have the low expression of this liver enzyme, so you can't even break down that drug, so you don't need a lot of it. Just take a little bit. Or you're a rapid ultra metabolizer of this one gene, so you're going to need twice as much of whatever medication you're on
Mm.
because it won't have much of an effect. So yeah, it's kind of a big deal. Like with SSRIs, there's a gene called HTR2A. It's some type of serotonin transporter, and people with the 2C allele copies, I think the gene is like RS6313 or something. Uh, if you have that one, you have 3.6 times the risk of side effects from any SSRIs like Prozac, et cetera, than if you don't have both copies. So
Wow.
you kind of don't want both copies. But then they've done other research that shows both copies is good for other things. So if you have low serotonin, you're going to try to increase your serotonin levels, just like people who have low dopamine, they increase their dopamine by doing wild things, right? Like adventurous stuff, skydiving or drugs or alcohol. Some people but it's called reward deficiency syndrome, having low dopamine. So then you try to raise it, hopefully in nice ways, not in risky behavior. But with serotonin, there's some studies that are showing that people with the low serotonin genetics, they're better at dating if they're male. So if they're male, they have more success because they get wild and silly, and then the girl she likes the guy as much because they get attention. But the studies also show that if you're not a very nice male, so if you're if you're not that likable, then it has the opposite effect. So maybe you should just keep your mouth shut, or else you'll have even worse success at dating.
A bunch of
So
guys are going to be running out to try and grab a tester to be like, which gene do I have? What do I have to do
right.
here?
So it's like if you're likable, it'll make you more likable if you have that mutation, or if you're not likable, it'll make you less likable. So
it's interesting. You kind of almost like see it in personalities where you're like, I wonder if that like if you meet somebody who's really, really nice and really, really friendly, you're like, I wonder if they express that gene, or if they're just like a jerk and if they don't really aren't that friendly. And they're like, I wonder if they're just go walk up to them and touch them on the shoulder and just be like, have you gotten your genes tested lately? I really think you should.
Oh, and by the way, the HTR2A, this mutation. So if you don't have the wild and crazy variant, right? If people like you, it's because you're naturally likable, not because you're doing like wild and crazy things, life of the party. And it makes you better at human computer interfacing. So basically, that's like sort of like a geek gene, because you're really good with computers, but not so like social at parties. So it's kind of funny because it all depends on serotonin levels and some complex biochemical factors. So I've met people with both C copies, and it kind of makes sense. I'm like, yeah, they're kind of like that. And then I've met people without any of the copies, and like I have one of each. So I'm not really sure what I am.
Sometimes you're friendly, sometimes you're not.
I guess, yeah. Just sometimes I try to hack my own genetics for too much for my own good, but
well, I wonder, is it like always having to do with your genes, or can your environment really play a role in like who you are as a human? Like, for example, let's say somebody, you say there's a family who adopts a child, and sometimes they end up expressing in a completely different way than perhaps their biological parents were. But then there's also times where kids are adopted, and they, regardless of how they were born or regardless how they were raised, they still express like certain tendencies of their biological parents. And so does environment play a strong role in which genes maybe are expressed?
Oh yeah. Both are true. You're gonna be, the older you get, the more similar you are, you're gonna be as a biological excuse me, biological parents. You'll have like more commonalities, but the environment is a huge deal. Like, for example, somebody having an adverse experience in the womb, like if they were more exposed to testosterone and other androgens while in the womb, like week 6 to 20, they're probably going to have more heart disease, cardiovascular disease risks. Same applies to people who are exposed to more estrogens. If you're exposed to more estrogens in the womb, you're going to probably have bigger risks of cancer. And that's because estrogens are associated with cancer. So it actually helps increase proliferation. And you want a lot of cancer-like qualities when your cells are dividing, because you want a lot of division. You have like one cell, and it's supposed to turn into an entire liver. You have another cell, eventually it's supposed to be an entire kidney of billions of cells, right? So you do want this insane growth and proliferation. But then once you're finished growing your organs, you kind of want to stop. And
that'd be nice.
These stem cells are supposed to die. They're supposed to know when to hold them and then know when to fold them. And because of all the plastics in the environment and all the chemicals and all these estrogen-like plastic compounds, some of these cells don't die. They just become like sort of senescent, sort of dead, kind of like a sleeper cell. And then when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, all of a sudden they just like wake up and boom, cancer. It's like, what did this cancer come from? So then like doctors are like, well, I wish you'd have come to me when you were at stage 1, but you're at stage 4 now. So then the question begs, what if you took action when you were at stage 0? Like even
Yeah.
before you had cancer, what if you like started consuming an anti-cancer diet? So an anti-cancer diet is composed of 2 things. One, killing cancer cells, duh, but also preventing mutations from forming. So protecting uh, your genome. So like, eating more fruits and vegetables and reducing oxidation, all this low level inflammation causes mutations in your genetics, in your DNA. So if you can prevent the mutations in the first place, some of that, and then also some of inflammation actually killing cells that are becoming aberrant or cancerous, that's a really nice 1-2 punch for basically dying of something else in old age rather than some nasty, cancer.
And when you're talking about inflammation, I'm wondering, are you more talking about just like chronic inflammation? Because part of the body having immune response is inflammation, and that's a good thing, right? Like you roll your ankle, your ankle blows up, you have inflammation, and that's a good thing, right? Because it helps bring mediators to your ankle that help heal. But it's when we get into these states of chronic inflammation is when we're running into issues. I guess am I correct in saying that?
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. So inflammation is a very good thing. Of course, there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. So because of that, uh, you run into issues with adipocytokines, which are these inflammation um, molecules that are made by your fat cells, like your adipose cells. That's why they're called adipocytokines. And the more people weigh, the more inflammation they have. So it's a horrible thing. All this low level, little bit of inflammation day in and day out. Normally, inflammation is used for your body, just like you said, to fight stuff, right? You're fighting bacteria, you're fighting viruses. Occasionally, you might fight amoebas, you might fight parasites, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, it's beneficial, but when it's chronic, when you're like eating horrible foods and every day there's like some inflammation, it just begins to take its toll. In fact, when you look at all chronic diseases, which are partially due to low levels of inflammation all the time, including diabetes, including heart disease, which are like 2 of the top killers, right? That's responsible for 3 out of 5 deaths. So basically, at least 60% of all deaths in the world can be improved with just reducing inflammation a little bit. And you could test inflammation by there's like a CRP test, and you can do like a cytokine panel where they test all these inflammation molecules, TNF and IL-6, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things you could do to actually improve inflammation. And there's some diet and exercise things you can do. So some of the best things you can do is exercise, have some relaxation time. So, don't be like on the go. Let's say you're one of those high energy types where you're just always doing something. It's nice every day to just have, even if it's just 10, 20 minutes of like really quiet time, just reflecting on things. Also, the more fat cells you have, the more adipocytokines you secrete. So you don't want to get too heavy, because then you're basically anyone who weighs like, 300 or 400 pounds, who's obese, they have inflammation. They're going to have chronic inflammation by definition. So it's important to try to keep the weight to some manageable level. You don't have to be like, thin as a rail, but let's say your BMI is 50. It'd be nice to get it down to at least, 35 or something. You don't have to get down to what traditionally is like the perfect weight, but you could lose a few pounds, right, to improve longevity and health and a whole bunch of other issues. Curcumin is really good for inflammation. A lot of people undervalue the benefit of curcumin. Taking extra antioxidants, like eating healthier foods, and also maybe like there's even like vitamins that are really food sourced vitamins, like plant extracts, really good for you. Another big part of inflammation and reducing inflammation is getting sleep, sleep quantity and sleep quality. So sleep quantity, some people don't need as much. They feel fine after 5, 6 hours. Other people need 8, 9 hours, but generally 7 to 8 is a good number. And if you feel tired when you wake up, something's wrong. You're going to have to improve that. You're going to have to look into gut microbiome, make sure you have like melatonin producing bacteria or take a melatonin. Other supplements that really help with weight loss, garlic. Garlic actually helps with inflammation and weight loss. Um, Magnesium helps with inflammation. Coffee in some people who don't have, risk of stomach ulcers, coffee actually helps reduce inflammation. So that's
Mm.
another compound that there's a lot of research. When it comes to um, maintaining like a different supplement, which ones are better. Antioxidants are very important, and sleep is important. But there's some different genetic variants in sleep and genetic variants in other, um, risk factors. Like some people may need more magnesium, and you could look these up. One of the best things to do is just generally have more plant intake, because plants contain polyphenols, these compounds that reduce inflammation, and of course vitamins and minerals and roughage, fiber, etc.
Well, I'm thinking to myself, as a physical therapist, one of the hardest things I have to do is, just get people to exercise, right? And we're talking about so many different things in regards to just like managing inflammation and preventing chronic disease. And I guess, how do you process all the data? And is it just as simple as getting the foundation right and understanding your genes and kind of like starting a relationship with that? You think that's the best action plan moving forward for everybody, or do you think that we have to kind of take each one at a time and kind of get started in our own way?
Um, yeah, usually it's nice to do an overview, but in order to have long-lasting behavioral changes, some people, they just can't do it all. They just need to do just one or two things, and then after a week or after a month or two, then you could add on to it. So it depends on the person, but it's definitely important not to overwhelm, especially nowadays. I mean, in the old days there wasn't that much data. Now there's too much data. You can confuse people, so it's nice to just keep it simple and say,
Mm.
okay, let's just focus on exercise. Okay, next month, let's just focus on getting more vegetables. And the next month, focus on nuts and, sleep optimization or whatever. Just pick one or two things. It's
And
usually
when
better to do it that way.
and you said that's this technology now is available to everyone, right? And it's everyone can kind of access something to help kind of get started.
Oh, yeah. Like, for example, self-decode contains some very good genetic information. Some people go to Prometheus. That's a decent website for some information. But I would say that one or a self-decode. If you want to do like deep dives, there's nothing really better than Dr. Diodamo's Opus 23, but you have to find an Opus 23 practitioner, which you can. You could just go to datapunk.net, and they have like a list of nutrigenomic practitioners around the world. So I would say between those are some of the better outfits. Let's see. There's a few other places. 3x4 Genetics is decent. Um, there's Ben Lynch's site is pretty good. He has a nutrigenomics site. He's really good with methylation and some of the different compounds. Like one of the things he says is take more PQQ. PQQ is sort of like the active high-tech form of coenzyme Q10. Everyone's heard of CoQ10 in the supplement industry, but PQQ is supposed to be better. So ubiquinol is supposed to be better than CoQ10, and then PQQ is supposed to be better than ubiquinol. It's like it's like the liposomal vitamin C of coenzyme Q10.
Gotcha. And are there people, you talk to some leaders who are in the space there. Are there any arguments against using nutrigenomics to dictate an individual approach towards health and nutrition?
Yeah, there's a lot of arguments. The main arguments usually are unfounded, but sometimes are reasonable. So the unfounded ones are, well, when you're taking supplements, you're just pissing it away, and there's not really much of an effect because there's not enough research. But now there is research, because those arguments were all fine and dandy back in 2015, but there's been thousands and thousands of studies that have gone on by many reputable groups and research, whether it's in hospitals or clinics or, uh, in the medical space or even in academia. So there's a lot more evidence now than there used to be. So you can no longer say any dismissive statement. Now you're going to get ridiculed if you say, none of this works. It's just expensive urine. Well, not exactly. There's still a lot of questions to be answered. Don't get me wrong. But the evidence is very, very overwhelming, for example, that omega-3s help. Now, there's some studies, some studies from 2010, 2011, and also 2015 that kind of show that there wasn't really much of an effect. But then there are other studies that came out recently that are meta-analyses and very, very, very well done genetic GWAS, genome-wide association studies where they do the genetics of 10,000 people and then figure out, wherever let the pieces fall, right, where they may, and it's showing an effect. So omega-3s definitely good for humans, and it kind of makes sense because we kind of grew up around rivers, lakes, and streams, and what are in rivers, lakes, and streams but fish, right? Another one that used to be not very well liked is vitamin D. It's now showing vitamin D is great for you. Basically, vitamin D is great for pretty much everything except cardiovascular disease. So that sounds a little weird, but every study that they've done, every meta-analysis doesn't show much benefit for cardiovascular, but it shows benefits for cancer, mental health, inflammation, inflammatory bowel disease, all sorts of issues, whether it comes from schizophrenia, issues with neurotransmitters. It's just great to have reasonable vitamin D levels. But yeah, if your issue is purely heart attack avoidance, there's not that much of an effect. But who cares? It's good for everything else.
Right. Well, what are
So
the
might as well take
barriers?
some.
What are the barriers to just adopting this idea then? Because it's okay, well, we have a lot more proof now. We're seeing that people's genes can really dictate what kind of medications we should be taking, what nutrition, what we should be taking in nutritionally. Why aren't doctors adopting it ASAP?
The reason not enough doctors are adopting it is because doctors are trained by institutions that are heavily funded by big pharmaceutical companies. And these companies are basically drugs and surgery is a really, really, they're really big money items, billions, and it's basically a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise, the world medical system. And because of that, a lot of the money that's looked into R&D are looked at pharmaceuticals that you can patent. You could also patent natural compounds, like combinations of compounds, but you can't patent any one natural compound because it violates US patent laws. It has to be artificially made. So because of that, no one's going to dump tens of millions of dollars into proving that magnesium is good for you in some capacity, because then anyone else can sell magnesium. So how are they going to be able to justify spending all that money? That's just the shareholders would fire the CEO, who would fire the research team, and they get somebody else in there. So part of that, that's part of it. There's other factors too.
One also question I have was the supplementation question, and supplements aren't really regulated all that often. And I guess, are there maybe brand names that you look out for, keep in your repertoire to try and take that are reputable and say what they actually have in them? Because I've seen a couple of studies where people look at I know gummy vitamins is a terrible example, but gummy multivitamins, where basically it's 50% of the time you're getting half of what you think you're getting, or you're not even getting anything at all. So I guess are there some brands that you trust in regards to just trying to get better nutrients?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Pure Encapsulations is a pretty good brand. I really trust them. Integrative Therapeutics is another good one. I like Metagenics. Dr. Diodamo's For Your Type, the number 4. That's a really nice one. They have some great products. Claire Labs is a very, very reputable supplement manufacturer. You know, they're trying to ban N-acetylcysteine, probably because it works too well. It helps with like mental health, inflammation, glutathione, antioxidants, all these different, helps with so many different things that I guess the FDA wants to make it prescription only. I don't know why. I could only speculate. But NAC was still offered by Claire Labs until just recently. Now it's back ordered. We're trying to get NAC to patients through other labs. Da Vinci Labs, pretty good, very nice supplements. Garden of Life has some really nice, some of the probiotics and different protein supplements. There's a few other ones too. But those are the ones like Now Foods. I like Now Foods as well. They have like really cheap but reasonable quality supplements in some of the different spaces. Standard Process has always been one of the big players. They have some very good protocols, purity, et cetera, et cetera. So
good. Well, you got some good name brands. At least get started to figure out which ones will work for you.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Well, believe it or not, we're hitting up to an hour and a half here, and you're kind of closing in on the end. And I appreciate so much taking time out of your day to help answer questions for all of us. And this last little portion is called the Health Me to Health You, and it's just basically 3 questions that I ask everybody at the end. And I'm going to ask you with the first question. And if you had the attention of everyone in the world for 30 seconds, what would you say?
If I had the attention of everyone in the world,
30 seconds.
I would say life is short. Try to be kind to everyone. Try not to judge as much as some people do. Try to be a little less judgmental. Work hard, everything you do. Try to do it with a passion. Make sure you get a little bit of fun in each day. And live life to the fullest.
Like it.
I would say.
I think that's the best 30-second one yet.
Oh my gosh. Hey, this is great.
Yeah.
Hey, do I get a prize?
We'll look into it. We'll figure out if we can get a medal or something going on here.
It doesn't even have to be like, real anything, just whatever, it's fine. Stainless steel, I don't care.
Yeah, right. Gold, doesn't matter.
I'll just try to show off to my kids. Hey, look at this.
Yeah, right. Second question, what book do you recommend, whether a book you're reading now or in the past?
Let's see here. Principles of Nutrigenomics is a pretty good book. It's let's see, who wrote this thing? I'm trying to remember. I think it was Dick Caterina. Yeah, with a C. Principles of Nutrigenetics by Dick Caterina is a really nice nutrigenomics book, pretty complete. There's another one that I have over here, Nutrigenomics and Proteomics by Martin Kussmann, Kussmann. So this is also a really nice one. I would say between those two, you're going to get just a lot of the top, most recent information. If you want to read a little bit more about epigenetics and glycomics, I would probably read Change Your Genetic Destiny by Dr. Diodamo. Change Your Genetic Destiny should be like a staple of any health practitioner or health conscious person, because it really gets into not just glycomics, but epigenetics and the effects of various compounds on your gut function and brain function, et cetera, et cetera.
Last question, where can people more find out about you? And, if people have questions, is there a place where people can reach out to you and ask you?
Oh, sure. If anyone wants to get a hold of me, you can send me an email at genetichealthcoaching@gmail.com. And then the website's genetichealthcoaching.com.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Really nice. Thanks, Mike. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.